There is a sentence that almost everyone has heard and almost no one has understood. It is 4 words long, 4 words that have been used to justify silence in the face of cruelty, endurance in the face of abuse, and submission dressed up as virtue. 4 words that have been preached from pulpits and whispered to the grieving and carved into the walls of churches and quoted by people who, in the very moment of quoting them, had no idea what those words were actually asking of them. Turn the other cheek. And if you are watching this expecting a straightforward reading of that phrase, I want to warn you now, because what Marcus Aurelius understood about this idea, and what he practiced across more than 2 decades of war, betrayal, and relentless personal loss, will almost certainly not be what you expect. It will not comfort you in the way easy interpretations comfort people. It will demand something far more difficult. It will demand that you become someone entirely different from the person who was struck in the first place. Most people hear "turn the other cheek" and understand it as a moral instruction about passivity. They read it as a command to absorb injury without complaint, to offer themselves again to whoever harmed them, to extinguish any natural impulse toward justice or self-assertion. The phrase becomes, in the minds of many, a spiritual endorsement of weakness. And this reading is not entirely without reason. The imagery itself seems to invite it. A person struck, a cheek offered, an injury compounded. It sounds, on its surface, like an invitation to be destroyed quietly and to call that holiness. But this is precisely where the misunderstanding begins, and it begins not in the words themselves, but in the frame through which people read them. They assume that the only alternative to striking back is to collapse. They assume that restraint must come from an absence of power, from fear, from an incapacity to retaliate. And so they read the act of offering the other cheek as a surrender, as a white flag raised not from altitude, but from the ground. Marcus Aurelius would have found this reading deeply confused, and he would have found it dangerous not because it counsels against violence, but because it mislocates the source of the choice. To understand what Marcus Aurelius actually practiced, you need to understand the world he inhabited. He was not a monk in a cell. He was not a philosopher who lived softly among books and students and could afford to theorize about patience from a position of comfort. He was an emperor. He commanded the largest military force in the ancient world. He had the absolute legal authority to execute, exile, or imprison anyone he chose. When people wronged him, and they did, repeatedly, spectacularly, the cost to him of retaliating was effectively 0. He could have destroyed his enemies with a gesture. And yet, in the private journal he never intended for anyone else to read, he returned again and again to a different instruction. He wrote in Book 6 of the Meditations that you should begin every morning by reminding yourself that you will encounter the arrogant, the ungrateful, the deceitful, the envious, and the violent. And he said that none of this should surprise you, and none of it should disturb you, because these people act from ignorance. Ignorance of what is truly good, ignorance of what they themselves are doing to their own souls. He did not say to pretend the harm wasn't real. He said to understand why it happens. There is a world of difference between those two things. The Stoic framework Marcus Aurelius inherited from Epictetus and refined through a lifetime of practice rests on a single, radical premise. The only thing that truly belongs to you is your response, not the events that occur, not what other people do, not the injuries they inflict or the insults they deliver or the betrayals they execute. Those things happen in the external world, which is governed by forces outside your control. What happens inside you, how you interpret what you experience, what meaning you assign to it, whether you allow it to diminish you or not, that is the domain where your sovereignty either lives or dies. This is not a passive teaching. It is, in fact, one of the most demanding teachings in all of human philosophy, because it refuses you the comfort of the victim position. It says, Yes, you were struck. And now the only question that matters is who are you going to be in the aftermath of that? Because that choice, and only that choice, is entirely yours. What Marcus Aurelius warned against, with a clarity that rings just as sharply today as it did in the 2nd century, was the reflexive impulse to respond to an injury by becoming the thing that injured you. He understood that this is what almost always happens. Someone acts with cruelty toward us, and we feel the pull to answer in kind. Not because cruelty is in our nature, but because the injury has temporarily destabilized us, made us forget who we are, made the other person's terms feel like the only available terms. And so we respond within their framework, using their logic, becoming a diminished version of ourselves in the very act of trying to protect ourselves. He wrote in the Meditations that the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. Read that slowly. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. He is not saying do not seek justice. He is not saying pretend nothing happened. He is saying that the most devastating thing you can do to someone who has acted basely toward you is to refuse to follow them into their baseness, to remain unbroken, exactly who you were before they acted. There is a historical detail here that deserves careful attention because it changes the entire texture of this conversation. Marcus Aurelius, who wrote those words, who practiced this philosophy at great personal cost across decades of difficulty, also persecuted Christians during his reign. Not with the systematic ferocity of later emperors, but he did not stop it either. Christians were executed in Lyon in 177 AD under his authority. This is not a small fact to set aside. It is, in fact, one of the sharpest ironies in all of Western intellectual history, that the man who came closest among Roman emperors to practicing the principles of the Sermon on the Mount, patience, non-retaliation, inner sovereignty over external circumstance, did so without any awareness that the people he allowed to be killed were teaching something structurally identical. He arrived at the insight from one direction. They carried it from another. And the tragedy of that convergence missed is precisely what gives the insight its depth. It did not belong to any one tradition. It was not invented by Rome or by Galilee. It was discovered independently by serious people who looked long and hard at what actually damages the human soul. Now return to the Sermon on the Mount, because the common reading is not only inadequate, it is historically illiterate. When Jesus says, "If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also," he is speaking into a very specific cultural context that his original audience would have understood immediately. In that world, a strike on the right cheek was not a punch. Striking someone on the right cheek with your right hand requires the use of the back of the hand, what was known as a backhanded slap. And a backhanded slap, in that culture, was not simply an act of physical violence. It was an act of humiliation. It was the gesture a master made toward a slave, a Roman toward a Jew, a superior toward someone they considered fundamentally beneath them. It communicated not anger between equals, but contempt from above. It said, "You are not my peer. You are not even worth the full strike that I would give a man I considered an equal. You are something to be brushed aside." When Jesus says to turn the other cheek, the person must now use the right hand in a very different way to strike again, the left hand being considered unclean, used for sanitary purposes, never for social action. By offering the left cheek, the person being struck is forcing the one who struck them to make a choice. Use the back of the hand again, which is no longer physically available in the same way, or strike with the open palm, which carries a completely different social meaning. To strike with the open palm is to strike an equal. It is to acknowledge that the person before you is a human being on the same level as yourself. Turning the other cheek was, in its original context, an act of sovereign refusal. It refused the terms of the hierarchy. It said, I will not participate in my own diminishment. You will either strike me as a man, or you will find that I have already removed myself from the drama you are trying to stage. This is what Marcus Aurelius understood from an entirely different philosophical tradition. You do not respond within the framework of the injury. You do not allow the terms of the one who harmed you to become the terms by which you define your response, because the moment you do, you have already given them something far more valuable than a second cheek. You have given them your center. You have allowed their worst impulse to become the gravitational force around which your best self now orbits. He wrote in Book 10 of the Meditations that it is not events that disturb the soul, but the judgments we make about events. And he was not offering this as consolation. He was offering it as instruction. The judgment you make, the meaning you assign, the story you tell yourself about what happened and what it says about you and what it requires of you, that is where you are either free or enslaved. The warning that runs through all of this, and it is a genuine warning, not a comfort, is that most people who follow this commandment do so for the wrong reasons. They turn the other cheek from exhaustion, not from sovereignty. They absorb the injury because they do not believe they deserve better, or because they are afraid of conflict, or because they have been conditioned by years of submission to mistake their paralysis for virtue. And these people suffer twice. They suffer the original injury, and then they suffer the interior damage of having surrendered to it while telling themselves a story about patience and grace that is really just a story about fear. Marcus Aurelius was explicit about this. Restraint that comes from weakness is not a virtue. It is a misfortune disguised as a choice. Real non-retaliation, the kind that actually costs something, can only come from someone who had the power to retaliate and chose not to. Not because the choice was easy, but because they understood something that made retaliation genuinely unattractive. What makes retaliation genuinely unattractive, in the Stoic view, is an accurate understanding of what it actually does to you. When you return an injury in kind, you are not restoring justice to the universe. You are not healing yourself. You are temporarily relieving a discomfort by creating a new one that lives inside you, that requires you to carry the same poison that was aimed at you. Marcus Aurelius compared the mind that allows itself to be poisoned by resentment to someone who picks up a coal to throw at another person and scorches their own hand in the process. The other person may or may not be burned. Your hand is already burning. Every moment you spend rehearsing the injury, every moment you spend planning your response from a place of wounded ego, every moment you remain inside the framework that the injury created. You're setting fire to yourself with material the other person handed you. The Stoics called this voluntary suffering. You cannot always control whether you are struck. You can always control whether you hand the fire back. And here is where the two traditions, Roman Stoicism and the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount, arrive at the same precise location from opposite directions. Both are saying that the person of genuine spiritual and philosophical development does not respond to injury from the level of the injury. They respond from a level above it. Not above it in the sense of indifference, not above it in the sense of cold detachment, but above it in the sense that their identity, their center, their understanding of who they are and what they are for, none of that is located in the injury. The injury happened on the surface. Their real life happens somewhere deeper, and from that deeper place they can look at the one who struck them and feel something that is almost impossible for the unformed person to feel, something closer to pity than to rage. Marcus Aurelius wrote that when he encountered someone acting badly toward him, he reminded himself that this person was acting from ignorance, not from evil in the cosmic sense, but from a failure of understanding, from a stunted interiority, from a life that had never taught them the connection between their inner state and their outer actions. He did not say this made the harm less real. He said it changed what the harm required of him. there is something else hidden inside this that rarely gets addressed. Both the Stoic tradition and the teaching of Jesus, whatever you believe about who Jesus was, are asking a question about identity. They are asking, who do you believe yourself to be? Because if you believe yourself to be a creature of circumstances, someone whose nature is defined by what happens to you and how people treat you and what you have been given or denied, then retaliation is nearly inevitable. Because your identity has been touched, contaminated, diminished. Of course you want to restore it. Of course you want to strike back. The self that was constructed from external materials is always one insult away from collapse, and it defends itself with the same violence with which it was built. But if your understanding of who you are comes from somewhere that the injury cannot reach, from a rational soul, in Marcus's language, from the image of God, in the language of the sermon's tradition, then the person who strikes you has not actually touched anything essential. They have struck the surface. The surface matters in the sense that pain is real and justice is real and consequences are real. But the surface is not you. And from that knowledge, really held, not just performed, you can make a choice that looks from the outside like patience, but from the inside feels more like power. Marcus Aurelius practiced this on an extraordinary scale. He served as emperor during years of plague, during the devastating Antonine Plague that killed millions across the empire, during military campaigns on the Danube that stretched on for over a decade, during the betrayal of people he had trusted and elevated. He wrote the meditations during those campaigns, not for publication, not for posterity, but as a daily exercise in self-correction. He was not always succeeding. He was reminding himself every morning of principles he needed to inhabit that day because the day was going to test them. He was not a saint. He was a practitioner. And the difference matters enormously because it means that what he described was not an ideal state for perfect beings. It was a discipline for imperfect ones. He failed. He corrected. He returned to the practice. He failed again. What he never did, as far as the record shows, was abandon the framework. He never said the framework was wrong because it was hard. He said it was hard precisely because it was demanding something real. The deepest irony of the phrase "turn the other cheek," and perhaps the deepest irony in this entire conversation, is that the people most likely to dismiss it as weakness are often the people most enslaved to what it is warning against. The person who says, "I would never let anyone treat me that way," and feels proud of their refusal to absorb injury, is often the person most completely controlled by other people's behavior, because what controls them is the injury itself. Every slight determines their response. Every unkindness sets the terms of their inner weather. They believe they are showing strength by retaliating, and they do not see that the retaliation proves how thoroughly the other person has colonized their interiority. The one who retaliates has not refused to be diminished. They have merely changed the direction in which the diminishment travels. Marcus Aurelius saw this clearly. He saw that the emperor who lashes out in anger at an insult is more enslaved than the philosopher who absorbs it in silence, not because the philosopher is weaker, but because the emperor's rage proves that someone else still holds the key to his peace. This is the warning. This is what he was saying when he wrote that the best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. The warning is not about the other person. The warning is about you. It is about what happens to you when you let injury redefine you, when you let the worst moment someone else has offered become the organizing principle of your response to the world. The warning is that you can spend a lifetime believing you are defending yourself, when really you are simply guaranteeing that the injury never ends, that it becomes a permanent feature of your interior landscape, a wound kept open by your own hands, because closing it would mean letting go of the story in which you were wronged, and that story has become the only identity you have left. To truly turn the other cheek, in the sense that both Marcus Aurelius and the Sermon on the Mount are pointing toward, is not to pretend the blow did not land. It is not to smile and offer your suffering as a spiritual performance. It is to stand in the aftermath of injury and refuse to be reorganized by it. It is to know yourself deeply enough that no single act of another person can reach the place where your center lives. It is to look at the person who harmed you and understand with genuine compassion, rather than manufactured forgiveness, that they acted from a poverty of understanding that you are not obligated to share. And it is to choose, from that place of understanding, from that altitude, what your response will be. Not the response of fear, not the response of paralysis, the response of someone who has already won the only fight that actually matters, the one inside themselves. That is not weakness. That is the hardest thing there is. And almost no one who quotes the phrase has ever come close to understanding it.